over. Today we've got two really great presentations from Sean Donovan, who's the Environmental Services Department Manager from the San Antonio River Authority, and Stephen Johnson, a Senior Planner from the Houston-Galveston Area Council. Just a few quick webinar procedures for you all. As a reminder, please be sure to keep your microphone muted until the end of each presentation, where there'll be a question and answer session. There will also be time at the end of the webinar for any final questions. And of course, you can always utilize the chat box and the raise hand function as well. And I'm really hoping that we'll have a robust roundtable at the end too. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the NCTCOG PMDL webpage under the green banner labeled workshops. I'll also make sure that y'all have the direct link to that website in the chat. All registrants will receive an email with the link to the slides and the recording once it's been posted. And like I said, it's my hope today that attendees will learn more about these regional programs from the San Antonio River Authority and the Houston-Galveston Area Council's TMDL programs, and discover how maybe we can look to implement some of these lessons learned in the COG region while sharing information on a more local level about your own TMDL programs during the roundtable session. Before we jump into presentations, I do have just a quick overview on NCTCOG and our TMDL program. So for those of you that may not be familiar, COG is a voluntary association of local governments with I think over like 230 members. We assist our members in planning for common needs and cooperating for mutual benefit. And the COG area is the 16 counties that kind of surround Tarrant and Dallas County, but our TMDL project area is a little bit smaller. So we do have bacterial impairments in the North Central Texas region, specifically for E. coli. Many things can cause these impairments, such as pet waste, illicit discharges, wildlife waste, and more. And it's important for us to address these impairments in order for our waterways to ensure that they meet their designated use, such as recreation. So a TMDL or a budget is set to ensure that these waterways can safely maintain their designated use. As I mentioned, we do have 23 current impaired waterways in the TMDL implementation plan, or I-plan, which is shown on this map here. The most recent addition to the I-plan was North Fork Fish Creek, which is in the Mountain Creek Lake Tributaries watershed. And through this I-plan, COG works with local governments and members to implement best management practices, develop materials, educational materials, and others to reduce bacteria sources, such as participation in regional initiatives such as the Wastewater and Treatment Education Roundtable, the Integrated Stormwater Management Program, other education and outreach methods, and more. And the I-plan, along with our stakeholders, also guide projects and workshops selected by y'all, such as today's workshop. We do have an array of available resources, including educational explainer videos, resources for septic systems, resources for discouraging your residents to not feed the birds, encouraging pet owners to always pick up after their pet, and more. We also distribute quarterly newsletters and an annual program summary, which highlight activities within the region as well. These resources are available on that TMDL webpage that I linked in the chat just a moment ago under the green banner labeled resources, and also under septic system resources as well. We have a couple new resources that should be available in June. It's the Do the Right Thing educational explainer video and an OSSF or septic system postcard for y'all to send out to those that have a permitted septic system. I know I ran through that information pretty quick, so does anybody have any questions before I turn it over to Sean Donovan? Awesome. And I know we had a few more people join the line, so if you don't mind, go ahead and introduce yourself via the chat box. That way we know who all is on the line today. All right, so we're going to turn it over to Sean Donovan, and he is the manager of the Environmental Services Department, has been with the San Antonio River Authority since 2012. The Environmental Services or sciences. I have sciences in service, sorry, is responsible for the collection, analysis, quality assurance, and the data management of the River Authority's environmental data, including ambient and stormwater quality, fish, freshwater mussel, aquatic insect, and habitat surveys, and other special projects based on various community and organizational needs. So Sean received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi, and he is a certified fisheries professional and an active member of the American Fisheries Society and is a certified project management professional. So Sean, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Hannah. It's always weird hearing your biography read whenever you're here in the room, so I appreciate that. So I'm going to share my screen here and go through some slides with everybody. But you know, as Hannah mentioned, you know, all of these things are so very site specific as far as what's going to work in each different basin. So I try to pull some management measures out from our experiences that might be comparable to something like, you know, the North Central Texas Council of Governments and you know, with like the urban rural divide, maybe some things with like Bexar County down here that may be applicable up there in, you know, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So I think it's, you know, an interesting comparison between the two basins. But, you know, again, if there are additional questions or people want me to stop as I'm walking through and ask questions on some certain things, we've had kind of a long journey on the TMDL and I-Plan road. And so it's very, you know, very necessary to cut out, you know, kind of a lot of the context in some of these things. So try to put it in context for you. But again, if there's other questions or comments, please feel free to jump in and don't wait till the very end so we can kind of have those questions real time. So the first couple things I want to go into are just really a little bit about the River Authority down here and how it plays. And you know, I think this is an important slide to talk about how it plays into our what we call the upper basin and lower basin and the different meetings. But we're a very unique river authority that we have an elected board of directors. We're the only river authority in the state that has an elected board of directors. All other groups, all the river authorities have appointed boards of directors. And so, you know, this is truly a manifestation of the will of the people, if you will. You know, the kind of the idea of different peoples in different counties are going to advocate for different things based on the feedback from the constituency that they have. In our case, there is a big, and I'll put it in scare quotes because it's a big perceived urban-rural divide. And I'll kind of get into a little bit here about how, while the problems may seem very different in the two areas, there are a lot of similarities based on, you know, kind of the data that we found over time. So as you may or may not know, Bexar County is the seat of San Antonio is the seat of Bexar County. So, you know, Bexar County is over 2.5 million people. The city of San Antonio is over 2 million people, or, you know, right around 1.9 million people. Whereas Wilson, Kearns, and Goliad combined are somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people. So very, very small counties, very, very small populations south of town, and then a very huge urban city center here in town. And so, you know, you might think that some of these individuals are going to have, you know, different communities have different needs. That's true across the board. So the downstream counties might have different needs based on agriculture than the upstream counties based on development, real estate development. So, you know, kind of like starting to think about the mindset that you're going to be in when you're developing these TMDLs and these I-plans. And so to kind of break that down a little bit more from the county perspective and look at the actual watersheds, because we're going to talk about 2 TMDLs and 2 I-plans today. So the 2 areas to really focus on are the San Antonio River and what's called the Upper San Antonio. So you see kind of like this, I don't know, purplish peachish color. And then this reddish color, Salado Creek. So these 2 areas combined are going to be our first TMDL we're going to talk about. And the second TMDL we'll talk about is all the way down here at the bottom of the lower San Antonio River. So again, you have Bexar County. The county lines are kind of covered up here by this map, but Bexar County right here. Then you have Wilson County is going to contain, you know, all or parts of the Salado and San Antonio River, Upper San Antonio. And then here's the Wilson and Kearns County line. And so the lower San Antonio is almost entirely in those 2 counties. There's a little bit of a tail off here before the confluence with the Guadalupe River. So you can see, you know, not a terribly large basin relative to some of the other watersheds in the state of Texas, but it still goes across that urban-rural gradient, as most watersheds do. So I'm going to go through this chronologically. And the TMDL journey for us, if you will, started back obviously before September 2007, but the first TMDL in our basin for this section was approved in 2007. As I mentioned before, there were 3 different segments, and just to make sure to very quickly go through the kind of the vernacular of segment and assessment unit to make sure that we're all on the same page. Each one of these, so like Leon Creek has 2 segments. The lower Leon Creek and the upper Leon Creek are both considered segments. The downstream part of the San Antonio is the lower San Antonio River. That's a segment of river. And then within that segment, there are what's called assessment units. And so that might be a 10, 15, 20 mile stretch that is considered similar. If you took a sample from the uppermost part of that assessment unit and a sample from the lowermost part of that assessment unit, in theory, those are going to be the same water bodies. And so basically it's how can you compare these different areas? And so I just want to make sure that as I'm going through segments and assessment units that we're all kind of speaking the same language. So these different areas, these different segments have these different assessment units that had impairments for bacteria. And again, I know this is very basic TMDL kind of information, but just talking about what was happening here in our basin. So these segments with their impaired assessment units were rolled into this single total maximum daily load. Again, a document that was adopted in 2007. And they gave us reduction numbers for various pollutant sources. The one on this screen that will jump out is a little bit different than most, probably is the very specific one at the bottom there with the San Antonio Zoo. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that one because I don't know how applicable that is to other basins, but just to kind of briefly touch on it, we have a zoo, as you'd imagine, and there was an outfall from the zoo going into the river. That water was being pumped through a bunch of different enclosures for different animals, and the general consensus through limited sampling, but then just observational, was that was putting a lot of E. coli into the river. And so the idea was to put this treatment facility basically on the zoo, a UV treatment facility that would then reduce the amount of bacteria from the zoo. It's had varying degrees of success, but again, that one I'm not going to talk about a lot because it doesn't really have a lot of applicability necessarily across the state. So the 2 that are applicable across the state are the non-point source reduction and the stormwater loading. So I know there's a lot of kind of differentiation between non-point source and stormwater. So stormwater is a non-point source until it enters a pipe, and then it's considered a point source. So for instance, if you have a street that is conveying water into a pipe that's going into the river or going into a treatment facility, that then becomes a point source. So it's kind of some weird vernacular there. But what I really want you to look at is the percentage of reduction. The percentage of reduction between the San Antonio and the Salado Creek is a little bit different, and I'll kind of talk about why. And really the first part is the actual watershed itself. So a lot of people think of the San Antonio River, and this is the picture that they think of, the Riverwalk, highly channelized, highly urbanized area. And that's true, that this is the San Antonio River that does flow all the way down to the coast. But not far downstream, about 12 miles or so, this is also the San Antonio River. So this is, again, about 12 miles south of downtown. You can see this really, really nice riparian vegetation, this really nice in-stream cover. This is a really good habitat for fish and freshwater mussels. And so this is a really healthy part of the river. And again, not very far downstream of San Antonio. And so the run of the upper San Antonio is 85 miles. So if this is only 12 miles south, you can see there's going to be wildly different inputs into the river. And that's kind of like the kind of the general consensus there, the common thought we had is like the sources are going to be very similar. Then you start looking at something like Salado Creek. So this is even more urbanized. This is a great picture of a Salado Creek site. You can see on the right-hand side, it has really good overgrowth. There's some erosion, but you have really good trees all the way up to the bank. Then on the left-hand side there, you have a park, you have a greenway, and this is very common. You have this kind of like natural mixture with some very highly urbanized areas. Salado Creek also goes right through neighborhoods and very, very heavily urbanized areas with a lot of impervious surface, a lot of runoff. So again, you're kind of getting an idea of what these watersheds might look like. And the interesting part here is that you have a significantly higher goal for the reduction of non-point sources and for stormwater. And the idea is that with this watershed, because it's so contained within San Antonio, that you don't have that kind of agricultural input farther downstream. Whereas in the San Antonio, you do say, okay, well, you're going to have the urban loading, but you're also going to have the agricultural loading, the rural loading that's going to be more wildlife and cattle and those kinds of things. So that's kind of the general notion that went into this original TMDL. And just to give you an idea, this is a document from, this is a screen grab from that 2007 document talking about the actual, pollutant sources based on the study. So you can see between residential and commercial and industrial, it's 94%. Rangeland very, very low, and then direct source, as you'd imagine, with bacteria pollution, what direct source is. But this number is a little bit different as you move into like the San Antonio, but you can see urbanized, almost all of this is being contributed to kind of like directly human related activities. So we're going to put the upper one aside just for a second and talk about the lower, because this will happen the very next year was this TMDL for the upper, or the lower was created, excuse me. This was a single segment, and this segment was broken down into 6 assessment units. So again, talking about just, similar stretches of river are broken down into these assessment units. And just as a reminder, again, this is the lower basin. There's no major cities downstream here at all. There's a few different incorporated areas, Goliad, Karnes City, some of the areas that are much smaller towns, well outside of this highly urbanized area. And even as you get farther to the coast, this isn't going to any really big coastal towns. Victoria's farther north, Refugio's not too far away, but this is a really, really rural area that the lower San Antonio goes through. So I love this attaining water quality standards required is 0 to 51% reduction. So, we saw the last one, we had like 60 or 90%. This one seems to be like, let's just throw a dart at it and see 0 to 51. Well, the reason we have 0 to 51 is this was assessed on 4 different sites in our southern basin. One of those sites under high to medium flow conditions was basically like, you don't need to do anything at this one site because over time, this one site has shown to be pretty stable with water quality. Whereas the other 3 ranged from, I think it's like 17, 40, and all the way up to 51%. So the reason why it says 0 to 51 is because the least site is 0, the greatest site is 51% reduction needs. So that's kind of why that very weird number is there. And the other part is this reduction in point source loading. So one thing that we'll go into in a second here is that there really wasn't much of a target on actual treatment falls, so wastewater treatment plants in the upper San Antonio, where there was a greater focus and emphasis on treatment facilities in the lower basin, largely because the plants are much smaller, the oversight isn't as great. And so the theory was that some of these treatment facilities were discharging, maybe not being able to handle the high flow events whenever you have a lot of stormwater coming into the system, discharging more from those point sources. And so again, you have a little bit more of an emphasis on this point source loading reduction than you did in the upper. So again, just kind of framing that of what those two things look like. You can see some differences here. And so actually getting into the implementation plans that we're currently in, this one it's not finished, but we're beyond the yearly check-in points. We're not going every year to check in on this document and talk with our partners. So as you see here, there were 30 management measures. A few of those were completed before the final approval of this document. And so those were ongoing while the conversations are being had between partners. People were implementing different management measures, mitigation strategies. And then by the time the document was actually approved, it was actually 23 active management measures, 7 completed. And then we didn't have any control actions. And so again, just to quickly clarify what this means is management measures covered non-point source and control actions cover point sources. A little bit too much of a simplification, but a good kind of rule of thumb is that management measures are not treatment facility related and control actions are treatment facility related. There's some gray area there, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb when looking at management measures and control actions. And as you can see here too, one thing that I'll talk about in lessons learned is that, the engagement of partners is a really, really important thing. I don't know of any organization that can do any of this by themselves. So making sure that people are engaged early and often is a really, really important thing. And you can see here with all these organizations, Soil and Water Conservation Board couldn't fit well with the rest of them. So I just put them out there. There's no slight at the Soil and Water Conservation Board. They've been great. But I wanted to make sure to point them out in the top right up there as well. So again, partners are very, very important in this entire process. And what I want to do is I really want to call out 2 management measures that's going to lead to a very specific success story, because again, I think that this has the ability to be moved from basin to basin. Again, it's never going to be an exact one-to-one, but I think there are some things that can be taken from our lessons learned. So the first one is a stream restoration project. And from its holistic perspective, this may not be a realistic thing to be done everywhere. And the reason why I say that is that the Mission Reach Ecosystem Restoration and Recreation Project, I'm just going to call it Mission Reach from now on, was a part of a $385 million project package through the Army Corps of Engineers, the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, and the San Antonio River Authority. So obviously you can't just go, all right, well, let's go do a $385 million project here, because then if you had that kind of money, you'd be able to solve all sorts of problems. But what I do want to kind of talk about is a knock-on impact that we've been able to have that have been smaller, more manageable projects that have continued to add value to this overall restoration. So as the slide shows here, this project took place over 5 years as far as the actual construction. It was happening much longer before that, as far as, you know, getting the funding secured and all of the workings before actually putting a shovel into the ground. And this restored about 9 miles of the river. And we really do have a lot of good measurable ecological benefits that we've seen with this, from you know, avian diversity. The number of bird species here before the study were blank, and they are now 5 times higher. The fish diversity has gone from this to this, and freshwater mussel health has gone from this to this. And we're in the process of doing a freshwater mussel reintroduction in the Mission Reach, and we're very proud of that. It's one of the first, if not the first of its kind in the state, and that couldn't have been made possible without this restoration. But again, that's a huge lift. And so just to kind of give you an example of the scale, so this is a picture of the San Antonio River. This, at the time in 2008, when this was being done, this little side channel was the water being diverted. As you can see, this is not hospitable to really any animal at all. And this is, you don't have to worry about bacteria in the main stem of the river, because there's really no main stem of the river. It's over here on the side. Well, just a few years later, this is a picture and about the same area. So you can see where this truck is. There's a little bit of this bend going back to the right. And so if you look here, this is that same bend going back to the right. The vantage point is obviously different. This is us standing in the river, but you can see, like, this restoration has really done a great job. You have really stable banks. You have this riffle in the water was created by itself. This is not an engineered riffle at all. You have really healthy riparian corridors. And so again, you can see this restoration has done a great job, but there are areas where it hasn't done such a great job. And so as you can see here, all of these say erosion, with the exception of you know, a couple of them, you know, kind of farther downstream, but these are all erosion-based projects. And what we've had to do is continue to go back in and look at sloughing off of sediment on the banks, because one of the biggest problems with bacteria is sediment bringing bacteria into the river. And so again, restoration project, huge, millions and millions of dollars, but these erosion projects are fairly small and can really help. Whether it's a restored area or a natural part of the river, can really help stabilize that bank, which is going to help stabilize the riparian corridor, which is going to help with filtration of water. It's going to help slowing that water down, and it's going to help that system be much more natural and do those natural processes. And so I'm going to pull out one example. So as you can see, the orientation of this map's a little bit odd. So this is actually west on the far end and the east at the very low end. So we're going to we'll flip that in a second here. So we're going to talk about one called the Lone Star Erosion Repair, and this is just right outside of downtown. So this is called Roosevelt Park. Keep an eye right here on this gazebo. We're going to see it from a different vantage point. I just want to show how close it is to San Antonio. So this is that same gazebo on the right here, and you can see Tower of America. So you're looking up this canoe chute, which is right here. Looking up this canoe chute on a day with more water. You're looking upstream, see the tower. You're very, very close to downtown. And where we had this bank erosion was just upstream. So again, here's the canoe chute to kind of hopefully keep orienting you, or just totally throw you off, not sure. But this is that canoe chute. And so you can see this bank over here on the side, and you can see the pipe going into the water. So this is an area that is getting really, really eroded, and this bank is starting to slough off. You're starting to expose pipe. You're starting to have some potential issues with polluting the river if something happened to this pipe. And so you want to be able to, this is actually an outfall right here. You want to be able to kind of stabilize this bank. And so what we were able to do is go in and do, kind of what's called natural channel design to stabilize this bank. And so a lot of times if you have an eroding bank, you could go in and you could put concrete blocks up there, you could put gabion baskets, and you could put some sort of hard gray structure there. But you're not going to let any of those natural processes take effect still. You're not going to have an area that's going to filter water coming into the river. You're not going to have any sort of in-stream habitat for fish or animals or mussels that help clean water. You're basically just going to be stopping that erosion. Well, what we did is, as you can see here, this is really interesting. So this would be like a big tree with the roots coming out. And that tree is basically shoved into the bank to stabilize the bank. You then have cuttings and you have different kind of vegetation going back on that bank to help stabilize. But this provides great in-stream cover. It provides that stability you still need, but it provides that opportunity for the ecological system to kind of restore itself. And so as you can see, over time, this is what it looked like before the work was done. This is the same bank, just looking upstream instead of downstream. This bank is stable. This is vegetation growing, and then just right now, a couple of years later, this is a really grown up area. You have some good trees in that area that we came in and replanted. And so again, this might not look like a big thing, but again, this is one erosion repair project out of a lot of them. And so you can see if you start propagating this throughout and you start having this bank stability and you start letting the riparian system do what it wants to do and clean the water and filter that system out, you're gonna have better and better water quality. Because again, one thing with this is it's not like, here's the silver bullet, bacteria problem solved. It does take this consistent effort to do all these different, these mitigation efforts or strategies across the basin. Another really good example of that, another one of our management measures, were best management practice assessments and pilot studies. So again, same kind of thing is it's sort of like the bacteria problem is really a death by 1,000 cuts. And so in order to fix that, you have to go back and start fixing each one of those cuts one by one, or mitigate those with better management measures somewhere else. And so again, these may not seem like huge projects on their own, but as we're doing these residential rain garden works, you can see here, this is a little bit of a rain garden catchment area. You can have some filtration there. These rocks are going to kind of slow some systems down before it goes into this drainage grate to the street. So you can see you're capturing some stormwater. The same thing can be said here. So this is one of our school grant projects. So what we've done is over the past 5 or 6 years, we offered school grant projects. And so we would work with local high schools or middle schools or elementary schools and say, hey, you want to do a landscape project. We would like you to treat some stormwater on your property. We'll put in X number of dollars if you promise to do O&M or if you match it with these dollars. And so this is something at one of the local middle schools. I believe this one is down in Floresville. It's a small little, small visual of a rain catchment system. And so this is going to capture water here. What you can't see is it keeps going to the left. And if water overflows here, there's another rain garden here. So again, it's about treating the stormwater. And just like the erosion control, it's like small projects in a lot of different places are going to make that benefit over and over. And so one benefit that we've seen, and again, I'll talk about this other part, kind of this questioning of a success story, because again, it's for every win you have, there's another way to look at it too, is in the 2022 annual report for non-point source pollution put out by TCEQ and the Water Conservation Board. This was one of the success stories that they highlighted was our Upper San Antonio TMDLI plan. So this segment where some of those areas like the Mission Reach erosion control and some other studies we've done, this was that segment is 1911, the Upper San Antonio, and 07 is an assessment unit. You can see from the first integrated report to this integrated report, the last one we had effective prior to this report coming out, you had a reduction in 21% of E. coli loading in this assessment unit. Now I say again, question mark is like, is it a success story? Because you see the two assessment units upstream, these are both getting significantly worse. And so, we want to make sure that we're looking at certain areas and we're saying, okay, this can be a success story, but also looking at like, what's the next thing we have to do? What's the next thing we have to improve upon? And you can see that some of these areas like slowing down water and treating things and trying to spread those floodwaters out are helping. Because again, you're not having this propagation of these upstream pollutants going downstream. Because I think we all know that, urban city centers can have a really negative impacts on water quality. Theoretically, as you get to more natural spaces, you're going to have higher water quality because those natural systems can kind of take hold. So this is always kind of like that mixed bag back and forth. And we'll talk about this as a lesson learned in a couple minutes here as well. So the other one is the Lower San Antonio. This one is much less robust because there's much less diversity as far as the coverage in this county, the land uses in this part of the counties. And so we only had 9 management measures and 2 control actions, fewer partners, but still a really robust partner set. And again, just as a reminder, control actions are specifically targeting treatment facilities. And the one I really want to highlight here is the specific management measure was this title: promote the reduction of illicit dumping and the proper disposal of waste. But the big thing that this really did, and I was kind of going through these numbers, and like 80,000 tons of hazardous household waste and 5,000 tires and 50 tons of e-waste. And I wanted to put like the immeasurable goodwill as priceless, but I wanted to avoid like I forget which credit card that was, that joke. But the goodwill we've gotten with the downstream counties has been tremendous for us, because there wasn't always a trusting relationship between the river authority that's located in Bexar County and our downstream communities, because it was like, oh, well, you have these people in this urban center coming down and telling us how to do this. And I am obviously, generalizing the relationship in these broad strokes, but there was a lot of that distrust between, what's going on in San Antonio, what's going on in the downstream counties. This has been a tremendous way that hasn't cost us as an organization a lot of money, but has made tremendous strides in really, mending a lot of the bridges and creating a lot of really, really good relationships with our downstream county constituents, to the point where we don't have to seek out partnerships anymore. We get calls from downstream county communities to come down there and help them with problems, or, why aren't we expanding programs to be more beneficial for our downstream county constituents? We built the first, large public park in Karnes County just a couple of years ago, called Escondido Creek Parkway. And I genuinely don't think that could have been possible without the work of these types of events, because again, it really created a really strong, engendered a really strong relationship between us and our downstream county constituents. And so, I may be overstating that, but again, at least from my perspective, this has been a tremendous help in us establishing a good relationship. And the overall benefits of what this has happened, you can see a removal of a ton of tires, hazardous household waste of old TVs and laptops and other things as far as like e-waste. And so it's been a tremendous resource to the community, and a tremendous olive branch from us to those individuals and to that community. And you can see just from, these are all the assessment units. You can see overall it's a pretty good story. We have quite a bit of reduction in some of our sites and some of our stream segments assessment units. And then even the ones that have not been getting better are only marginal. They're right around that impairment or not impairment list. And so again, this is a really encouraging thing, that as development has happened, we may not be reducing, but we're certainly holding the line at worst in a lot of these locations. And so this is really promising information from the lower San Antonio River, and we're continuing to work with people down there. So, the same thing can be said about some of our tributaries. We haven't been doing as much sampling in some of these water bodies. We've been doing more in others, but you can see the reduction in 2 of these smaller tributaries. I talked about Escondido Creek Parkway. That's a park that goes through one of our towns. Cabeza Creek is a small area outside of another town. But these 2 creeks obviously are getting significantly better as far as water quality perspectives go. So just to wrap up very quickly with kind of the lessons learned, the big thing, obviously, with all of these things, as they're stakeholder-driven processes, is like the community engagement, the partners is the end-all be-all. If you are an organization, you're like, I'm going to go at this by myself. I see, some of the participants here. If DFW Airport said, we're going to do an implementation plan by ourselves, it's not going to be very effective. If the city of Denton does it by themselves, it's not going to be very effective. But if DFW and city of Denton and all these different city of Plano start coming together and working together, you have that really robust partner system. It's not necessarily like it's not a gotcha, but it's holding each other accountable. It's making sure that you guys can add benefit and add value. If one group is doing this small thing, it's a small effort, but if 10 groups are doing something small, it becomes a big effort. So it's really cool to see the diversity of partners on the call here today. And engage the community early and often, even if they aren't partners. They don't have to be, signatories to the document or people that are committed to certain management measures, but outreach to the community, find ways you can connect, and then throw the messaging from something like an I-plan into that conversation. That's huge. Again, you create that goodwill, you engender trust, you have that connection to people, and you never know, like they might bring you the best idea you guys have ever heard before. So I think that community relationship is really important, even if they're not partners. Another one that I just didn't have enough time to get to is bacterial source tracking. And I kept talking about like this perceived urban-rural divide. And while there are things you can do in an urban setting that you don't necessarily need to do in a rural setting, one thing we actually noticed is that we've done a ton of bacterial source tracking with Dr. Gentry from Texas A&M AgriLife in College Station. And we found that basically in our rural and urban communities that the sources contributing to the impairments are basically the exact same. In almost every location we've done, whether that's in the heart of downtown San Antonio on the Riverwalk or all the way down in Goliad County where there's not a house for miles, we've seen about a 50 or so % makeup of wildlife. So, birds and foxes and coyotes and deer and we've seen about 25 to 30% of livestock, domesticated animals. And then we've seen about a 5 to 8% of human, and the rest has been, just kind of like that unknown catch-all category. But we've seen about that same divide throughout our basin. That was really surprising for us. And I think it's kind of shifted our mindset to there's one thing to do in the rural communities and there's one thing to do in the urban communities too. There's probably applicability across the entire watershed. And then the last one is just celebrate when you can. I showed that, kind of quote unquote success story. If you can look at that figure and say, well, the water quality is getting worse here, we're not doing anything. Or you can say, we have work to do here, but we're doing something to make differences here in this area. And I think that's really important because these admittedly can get frustrating, can get hard to work on. But I think if you celebrate those victories when you can, then you're just going to be in a better and better place as an organization or as a group of organizations to continue to make a difference and work together. So I know I breezed through a lot of that stuff pretty quickly. There's a lot to take out of our experiences. I'm happy to talk offline with anybody or kind of dive into any more of these things in more detail. But again, I really do appreciate taking the time to listen to me today. Hopefully it was interesting, and I'm looking forward to any questions if there are any. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Great presentation. We've got a couple minutes before we need to move on to the next presentation. So we'll pause here for just a second and see if anybody has any specific questions for you. Feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself and use the raise hand function if you've got any questions. Stephen, go ahead.
So Sean, one of the things we're always dealing with is, the post and pre and post monitoring that's not ambient. So, we have projects that go in all the time, but we're not able to actually, codify or codify the amount of reduction or benefit that practice had. Have any of your efforts done any kind of, pre or post monitoring? Or are you primarily just relying on that ambient monitoring station to kind of give you a sense of success?
We do quite a bit of pre and post monitoring, whether that is we have two components of our stormwater monitoring that looks at in-stream sites. And so you might have a site on San Antonio River that, as imagine in-stream is just pulling water from a bridge during a rain event. But we also do have inflow outflow measurements from like a bioswale or a rain garden, for instance, to see the water going in, the concentration of E. coli is 10,000, the water coming out, the concentration of E. coli is 100. And so we actually have an active project in one of our parking lots here at the River Authority where we're looking at just that water coming off of a parking lot, going into a treatment structure, and then water coming out of that as well. And we are seeing, a significant reduction in. We do total suspended solids, nitrate, phosphate, and E. coli out of that BMP structure, and we are seeing a difference. And so that really helps, kind of further garner support from community groups to say, well, are you sure it works? And for us to be able to go, here's the data, this is what we did. Yes, we're confident that this works and can actually be put in practice. So that's been our experience. It's hard. It certainly is difficult to capture the stormwater events like that, but it is worthwhile whenever we just got a really good event a couple weeks ago from that parking lot, and it's really, really helpful data.
Great. I'll probably be reaching out to you. One of the things I'll probably mention today is we're looking at gathering some of that information. We've had some practices here put in place for about 10 years, and some of them have collected data, but it's not been widely put out to the community to encourage local governments to spend their dollars there. And so
Right.
we're trying to capture some of that information so that we can go to the local government and say, hey, if you put this top 10 list of practices in place, whether it's you as a government or you as a developer, and see that maybe as some success. And so I'll probably be reaching out to you for that.
Yeah, be happy to talk about that. And one thing I didn't mention here that wasn't straight from our team deals or plans is we've done a lot of work to try to influence the Unified Development Code here in San Antonio. And the two things that have really helped us, the credibility and the seat at the table with that, is that we have a really robust water quality modeling program. And the model tells us one thing, and if you can reduce in these certain areas, you're going to reach these different, levels of support or get rid of impairments. Well, the question is always like, well, what, they don't necessarily, people may not trust models. What's the data behind it? And then we can go, here's the data behind it. So that kind of tandem of information has been really, really helpful. And we actually we're about to do a West Side Creek restoration, and we just got implemented through the city council they're called, water quality zones. And so if you build in these certain parts of the city, you have to follow certain development procedures, certain development guidelines in order to build in those areas that treat stormwater. So that's been a huge victory for us. And I mean, again, these are not short-term things. It's commitment. It's making sure you keep talking and keep talking. It's not like you ask one time and all of a sudden it happens. You ask 5 and 10 and 15 times and talk to people and advocate, and all of a sudden you can get these things passed through city council. That's been a huge victory for us to hopefully, I didn't show the numbers for the West Side Creeks, but our West Side Creeks averages are very, very bad, and they're getting a little bit better, but they have a long way to go before they're out of the impairment area. So I mean, yeah, happy to talk about that stuff, Stephen.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Do we have any other questions for Sean before we move on? Didn't see any come through in the chat, but we'll make sure that you guys get a copy of Sean's presentation and his contact information just in case you have any questions after the fact. But again, thank you so much for speaking today, Sean, and hopefully you'll stick around and maybe we'll get some questions after the roundtable.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to turn it over to Stephen Johnston. Awesome. Okay, so Stephen is a senior planner in the Community and Environmental Department at the Houston-Galveston Area Council, also known as HGAC. He has spent the past 9 years working with the region's stakeholders, developing total maximum daily load studies and executing TMDL implementation plans to address the area's water quality impairments. He works as a project manager and as a stakeholder facilitator. Prior to joining HGAC, he spent 12 years working as a project coordinator for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality's Galveston Bay Estuary Program, implementing the Galveston Bay's plans, monitoring and research, and water and sediment quality action plans. He received his Bachelor's of Science degree in biology from the University of Houston at Clear Lake. Go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you for inviting me to attend today's talk and to provide some of the perspective from Houston. I know Dallas and Houston sometimes get into a little bit of turf war, but I think there's things that we can hold in common, particularly bacteria impairments. And so without further ado, let me get started. I know I have 30 minutes and I'll try to get that completed in time. So what is HGAC? HGAC is Houston-Galveston Area Council. Unlike Council of Government, it really is a Council of Government. I'm not sure exactly. I have to go back into the annals to try to figure out why we decided to call ourselves HGAC and not a COG. But we didn't. We function similar to the North Texas Central COG. As a matter of fact, we do cover 4 broad topics: transportation, public services, human services, and community and environment. I, of course, work in the community environment department here at HGAC. As Hannah mentioned, I've been here about 10 years. With that, I want to introduce that just so that I can start talking about some of the things that we do in the community environment, particularly our Clean Rivers program. Unlike other COGs, we do actually manage the Clean Rivers program and the monitoring data for our region. That includes working with our partners to gather data bacteria, nutrients, dissolved oxygen, and the like. We do provide that information on our website so that folks can go there instead of to TCQ for that information. And we do also provide analysis of that data. From this slide, I really want to point out all of our partners working together. We collect over 450 monitoring sites, and it's probably one of the highest monitoring sites regions in the country, if not in Texas. And so we use that data to help us determine obviously where impairments are, and that goes to TCQ to make those judgment calls. Of course, the one we're working off for assessments is the 2022 integrated report, came out last year. And so based on that, you see that's map to the left on the screen. Our region is certainly covered by bacteria impairments in all 13 counties that we serve. There are other issues in addition to contact recreation impairments. Those include fish tissue consumption, concerns related to PCB and dioxin legacy pollutants. There's some fecal coliform issues for our oyster waters where they're impacted by recreational and oyster reefs. And so there's an implementation plan for that one as well. And then we also have some aquatic life concerns due to elevated levels of nutrients. About 35% of our stream miles exceed state screening levels for nutrients. So we have chlorophyll A and dissolved oxygen issues as well. And so we're trying to address those things. And I think one of the important factors is we had the Clean Rivers program starting in 1990s, about 1992, if I'm not correct on that. In the 2000s, when we started talking about TMDLs and working with TCQ on TMDLs, we really wanted to do something about that. And so that's somewhat the reason we got into watershed-based planning. So starting in the mid-2000s with Bass Strait Bayou, we began to develop watershed-based plans, water protection plans, as well as total maximum daily load implementation plans. Our region, those 13 counties, we have essentially a watershed protection plan or implementation plan covering those counties, mainly to address bacteria, but we do have some dissolved oxygen TMDLs as well. There are 11 TMDLs in our region and 13 watershed protection plans. I want to point out on this map, I'm going to mostly focus on this kind of purplish outlined area for most of the rest of the talk. That's the bacteria implementation group area, and we'll focus on that. I do want to point out that we're also working on watershed protection plans within that area. One of the things we tried to do when we developed the implementation plan was to make it consistent with the water protection plan measures so that we could receive Clean Water Act 319 funding. Unfortunately, that was not allowed. And so we had to consider something else, and that was to fill in with water protection plans to give us that extra funding source as we move forward. Finally, from this slide, I do want to mention it's not on here. I did work for the Galveston Bay Effort Program, as Hannah mentioned. That Galveston Bay plan has been in place since the 90s, and it actually reaches up to you all up in Dallas. It's been said that the effluent that goes in from Dallas has been treated probably about 4 times by the time we get it out of our tap. So just a little bit of interesting tidbit. But we are connected, certainly, more ways than one. So a little bit of background on the Bacteria Implementation Group, or BIG. The group started in 2008. The TMDLs that were the precursor for the implementation plan in the BIG began in the early 2000s. Started with Buffalo Bayou and White Oak Bayou, but expanded out to include all that region that we'll cover here in just a moment. A diverse group of local governments, businesses, industries, and environment. I echo Sean's comment that it really is the stakeholders that make the improvements. It's not HVAC by and large. We don't receive funding to specifically do this kind of work, and I say that in more or less internal funding. We have to reach out for grants to support us to do this work. So it's really going to be on the shoulders of those local governments and businesses and the like to help actually implement the measures in our implementation plan. The committee that makes up the BIG is a 33-member committee. Consistently see 20 or more at our meetings, which we meet twice a year. The I plan began work in 2008, and that process was completed in January of 2013 with TCEQ Commission approval. One of the driving forces for this effort has been the Joint Task Force Phase 1 cities, city and communities, that's Harris County, City of Houston, Harris County Flood Control District. Beginning in 2008, they produced a bacteria reduction plan as part of their municipal separate storm sewer system Phase 1 permit. And so that got us started and leapfrogged us into the efforts, and I'll talk about that. We're currently updating the implementation plan, hopefully getting it completed this year, so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the project area is quite large. It's about 3,260 square miles. But Rhode Island, Delaware, it's about the same area. In terms of size, we also have been expanding since 2013, both internally in terms of the number of assessment units that are impaired, about 144 at this moment, but also some outlying areas that are adjacent to the big. We expanded into them as those TMDLs were completed. About 5 million people inhabit this region. We have 63 cities, either all or in parts, in our location, and 10 counties are part of this watershed area. We have over 600 wastewater treatment facility permits. Not all of those have bacteria in their permits, but we certainly have a large number of those, and about 130 municipal separate storm sewer systems. Phase 2 and Phase 1s are also in our region. So as just a little closer look at the impairments within the Biggs project area. Again, I mentioned 144 AUs of about 180 either have a concern for contact recreation or an impairment for contact recreation. And so we're trying to address that. I'll point out, it's a good place to point out, we talked a little bit about, at least Sean talked about the success and trying to get down to the standard. Some of our water bodies, I can tell you, it's probably not going to happen. We're talking about 5,000 geometric mean for bacteria in some of our water bodies, and it's probably not going to get down to the standard. And so some people always said, then why do it? Why throw up your hands? Why do this? It's really actually about managing risk. Again, just because you stick your finger in the water, you're not necessarily going to get sick. Don't recommend it necessarily in some of these water bodies. But that's being said, somebody does get in it. If we've reduced the chance of getting sick, reduced the risk, then we've had a success, whether we get to the standard or not. And so I think, I've had discussions with TCEQ about this, and I usually present in my stakeholder meetings that this is kind of our goal. If 50% of the water body is wildlife, and we're not going to be addressing wildlife, then we need to focus on the parts that we can address. Again, reducing what we can reduce to get to some beneficial effort. And so I'll leave you with that. Just again, the implementation plan we finished in 2013 in terms of it getting approved by the state. We produce an annual report each year covering efforts to improve the water quality and reduce bacteria. Of course, we'll talk more about that in preceding slides. Key issues. So we have a plan that covers 11 strategies and 38 actions or activities. So it's quite large. And I'll tell you, it's pretty vague in terms of endpoints or measured milestones. And so the difficulty in implementation, one of those difficulties or challenges has been what focus should we have? And so things that we've learned over time. If you were back in 2013, if you take a snapshot back then, a lot of the pointing or finger pointing was at wastewater treatment facilities. They just started measuring bacteria at their weirs and giving some kind of sampling. And so we didn't have the data to back up what they're saying. And so we've learned since then that by and large, yes, wastewater treatment facilities are doing their job. And so we've kind of honed in on 3 areas where we do think there's some effort needs to be spent, and that's sanitary sewer overflows. We have a number of those, and I'll talk about that. Stormwater pollution, again, a ubiquitous thing, whether it's a permitted system, MS4, or it's some non-point source. Stormwater pollution is certainly a big thing to work on. and then failing on-site sewage systems. And we'll talk about that and the numbers that we do have in our region. I'm not going to, there's going to be some of these slides in here that are kind of transition slides. I'm not going to really talk about it. Again, this is what's in our plan. I won't go into any of these individually, but these are kind of just to help us focus on the different topics. And so wastewater treatment facility is going to be certainly the topic we talk about right now. I mentioned over 600 wastewater treatment facilities in our region. Again, a lot of those are small municipal utility districts. About 64% of our area is covered by centralized wastewater. Of those 600 plus, about 528 of those have bacteria. And again, permits could be new permits that don't currently have data going in and they're self-reporting discharge monitoring reports. It could also be an industrial plant that doesn't have bacteria. And so those numbers are never going to be quite the same. But again, about 528 have bacteria limits that we look at. From those discharge monitoring reports, we look at permitted flow. And again, a wastewater treatment facility is able to release bacteria into their stream up to their permit limit. One of the things, and again, we go back to that control topic that Sean mentioned, for our plan, the majority of our wastewater treatment facilities in our project area have to meet half the permit limit. So the permit limit is currently 126 colony forming units or 100 milliliter. In our case, that's 63 for a lot of our wastewater treatment facilities. And so you might say, okay, well, why did that happen? Well, when the TMDL study came out, there were some thoughts that we couldn't get to the standard. And so it was at 126, so they backed it down to 63. That being said, even when we look at those discharge monitoring reports, by and large, we see that roughly about 97% of the time they're able to actually meet that 63 standard permit limit. And so there are some exceedances, and we certainly have some to work to do with wastewater treatment facilities, but not the largest contributor to the bacteria impairment in our region. Sanitary sewer systems, we're going to work into that again as a strategy area. We have about, on the yearly average, over 1,000 sanitary sewer overflows and 4.6 million gallons of effluents on average per year. You see those large dots, those are the larger wastewater treatment facilities, part of the city of Houston. Again, the SSO is not necessarily where those dots are. That's more or less where the wastewater treatment outfall is, but it's in that area that the SSO came from. So we have most of those coming from that older infrastructure. Again, the city of Houston's wastewater started again in the 1920s and 30s. And so a lot of that infrastructure was older, certainly more complicated with the number of lines that go into that system. And so we're having to deal with that. And the EPA and the city of Houston are working together to try to address some of those deficits. And then the city's been working on it since, as I mentioned, 2008 to really work on that. On-site sewage facilities, again, we have a number of those, about 50,000 permitted systems in our region, another over 100,000 that are not registered, unpermitted. You take that number, about 150, and go by a 19% failure rate. About 30,000 of those could be failing, an average of about 10,000 or so to either repair or replace. It's probably a little low. About 300 million just to address that system, those systems out there. We're going to be, and Hannah might know about it, I'm sure she can mention it. We're going to be working with North Central Texas COG to do something similar and get these on-site sewage facilities for your area online and make available. Real quick, stormwater, again, we have phase 1 and phase 2 stormwater permits in our region. This map's just looking at phase 2, which is based off the census designated urban area, at least to 2010. About 42% of our project areas have the phase 2. It's important to mention that phase 2 because I think that permit is getting stronger as we go forward in time. And there's discussions, or at least there's parts of that permit that tell the permittee to work with watershed groups such as the BIG and address impairments. And much like those phase 1 in the city of Houston, Harris County Flood Control District, already starting to address the bacteria impairment back in 2008 with their permit. we need to start working. It's one of the challenges for us is to really work with those phase twos and get that started in terms of trying to address their permit and try to address impairments within the area. And so a big factor for us going forward is to really get that moving. Modeling practices, I mentioned a little bit with Sean that we have a number of practices that have been installed in our region. Not all of the 70 plus that we've identified here on this map have data, but we're trying to tease out those that do, and again, trying to get information out to local governments so that they feel that spending that small amount of dollars they have on these kinds of practices are important, or updating their development codes to allow for developers to do these practices. Harris County has been a leader in doing that. They've adjusted it, as well as the city of Houston, to allow for green infrastructure practices to take place and more developments going forward. We just need to reach out to those phase two cities, those other cities out there to do more of that. Construction, I'm not going to spend too much time with construction. Again, it kind of ties into the phase twos and requirements to address construction and practices and VMPs. There's some talks with trying to work with some of our nonprofits to encourage more eyes on the ground to identify areas like the one that's pictured here, to get that information into the cities to say, hey, let's tidy up things a little bit more and to improve on things like erosion practices and things like that. Development pressure for us in construction is something I'm sure y'all dealing with up in Dallas as well. As we move out, again, we get those MUDs, utility districts, and more of that infrastructure going out into our area. We are rapidly moving from any agricultural production, particularly in Montgomery County, up here in this area. A lot of it's being turned over to hobby farms and larger acreages, but also seeing a lot more urban growth too. Illicit discharges, I'll be talking a little bit more about this and some of our best practices and talk about successes and efforts going forward. We also have an ag, animal, and silviculture strategy, working to address that. Land cover, again, I'm trying to push through this so we can get to some of the success stories and don't want to miss my time too much. We're obviously moving, as I said, to from more an ag and rural to one that's more developed as we go forward. Certainly, land cover changes. Also talk about outreach. Again, that's probably our low-hanging fruit, although it's very difficult to manage our successes. But I'll talk a little bit more about what we do with this in the success area. Monitoring in our I-Plan revision, they talked about, we based a lot of our stuff on ambient monitoring in terms of trying to gauge success and hopefully being able to tease out through our ambient monitoring stations whether we're seeing anything in our assessment units and some of the work that's being done. And I'll talk some more about that in our success stories. We also have a research component. One of those things, 10.1 is what I was talking with Sean about, evaluating the effectiveness of stormwater implementation. Again, trying to get that data in and actually make it usable. Harris County Flood Control District maintains a database. They put a lot of their work they've done into that database, but it's not easily accessible by local governments. And so we want to be able to pull that information out and demonstrate it. And finally, the 11th strategy is geographic priority framework. Really started with the idea we have such a large area, where are we going to put, pull up our sleeves and get to work. A lot of it started out with our targeted monitoring efforts, trying to prioritize those assessment units and where we want to go. But we've also started to pull in some social and economic considerations as we move forward and help direct us. And of course, there's funding out there that's also targeting social and economic considerations. And so those are kinds of things that we're trying to go forward with. We've put out top 10 lists to try to help, again, focus our area. If we've got an area that has a real high geometric mean, and maybe doing a little bit of work, we can see a larger improvement in that area, particularly if we can identify some human sources to be removed. I'm going to leave the I plan and move into implementation. If there's any questions, it might be a good time. If you have any questions about the big and its formation or anything like that, I'd be happy to answer those. All right, not hearing any, let's go on. So here's the bacteria trend for the big project area. Again, that's that whole area, looking at all the data together and doing a geometric trend across time. On this graph, let me orientate you a little bit. You might wonder, well, why is the one the standard? Well, we have both E. coli as well as enterococci to deal with in terms of the water quality standard or the state standard for contact recreation. And so to put them both on the screen, we've divided by the cells. And so all the data is also divided by the standard. So we're able to look at it. And we've seen, if you just look between 2006 and 2014, 2015, yeah, 30% or so reduction in bacteria. And you might wonder, well, why do we have that reduction here? And again, I mentioned, again, it's causal, but not necessarily an ability to say for sure. But again, I mentioned 2008, we had a joint task force. They put in a bacteria reduction plan. A lot of those things went into our implementation plan, where the city of Houston focused on sanitary sewer overflows and wastewater. The Harris County focused a lot on on-site sewage facilities in some of the areas, as well as incorporating low-impact development practices within their permits. And then finally, Harris County Flood Control District, including water quality improvement practices, LID, and that kind of thing within their stormwater detention. Again, their focus is on managing floods, but they do try to incorporate some of these practices as part of their permit. And so that's, again, it's causal for why we think that's happened. The question for us now really is, oops, going in the wrong direction, sorry, is what are we going to do about this, the fact that we stagnated? And, we may have hit the low-hanging fruits. We got to do, though, to get this to move in the right direction. And so that's really kind of why we're starting to look at updating the plan, updating the focus, again, targeting those other phase 2 cities for outreach and trying to incorporate some of these things that we've learned since the inception. Again, I mentioned the quick starts, Harris County and City of Houston trying to address construction, trying to address stormwater, City of Houston trying to address its sanitary sewer overflows. Those are some of the things that they started out with doing. One of the success stories I wanted to mention is the Aldine Westfield area. It's an area of Houston. Essentially, the city of Houston went around this area, so it's an unincorporated part of Harris County. So Harris County has been working with the East Aldine Management District to study this area, all on, for the most part, on septic systems. Back in the late 90s, they did a study and found that many of those septic systems, 30 to 50% of those were failing. And so they began to look for funding and began a process since 2014 to connect residential and commercial properties. About 811 of those properties have been connected to centralized wastewater, and about 1,400 on-site sewage facilities or septic systems have been taken offline. And we've seen about in Greens Bayou here, looking at this ambient monitoring station, we've seen about a 30% reduction there. Looking at these stations downstream on Halls Bayou, we've seen about a 20% reduction there. Again, it's still causal. We can't directly say that that's the case, but we feel that's pretty comfortable that maybe that improvement's coming from taking those failing systems offline. Again, the city, county has spent $43 million of community block grants, Texas Water Development Board, state revolving fund grants, and local bonds to do this effort. So it's not cheap, but again, they've tied them into wastewater. Other implementation things that we've been doing, again, HVAC has to go out and get funding for this. We don't have internal funds that can do that work. So we work in things like Trash Bash, where we provide outreach and education on water quality issues when we go out and pick up trash. On-site sewage facility workshops, working in communities to help residents understand their systems better. Texas Stream Team training to get individuals involved in water quality monitoring. We work with our ag partners. This is the Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board and our extension agents to put on workshops when we can. We also put on green infrastructure workshops in our region to again encourage that effort. Looking at structural practices, pet waste stations, evaluating and repairing on-site sewage facilities, trying to again expand lid practices through various projects, and then targeted monitoring. We'll go into a couple of these real quick, targeted monitoring and development and those kinds of things. Looking at targeted monitoring, this really started the City of Houston and the Bayou Preservation Association working with interns to go out and try to find outfalls that aren't permitted, that are flowing, not during storm events, but after post-storm events, when they shouldn't be flowing, and monitoring for those and trying to see if we can determine where potential sources are coming, and then notifying just that jurisdictions, the cities, the municipal utility districts, hey, there's a problem here. If it's underground, you need to hopefully investigate why we're getting a high load here when there shouldn't be a high load. We've kind of codified that process with HGAC and some of our partners, working with TCQ and the quality assurance project plans that you have to develop for that. And so we've had several projects since then that have also carried out this work. And we're trying to, again, see if we see some improvements going forward. And that's one of the projects we're doing. We have seen a few of our watersheds and water bodies improve. A couple of them here listed on the screen. And again, we're trying to do more of that. We've developed a low impact design toolkit for local governments. Again, we've captured the 70 projects in our area, 70 plus that are in our area that have been put in the ground, trying to do more of those, encourage local governments to do that. So there's a guidebook there. There's some other resources that are available as well. And we then work to have sessions or seminars with our local governments to expand that work. We also have an outreach toolbox. If you're a phase 2 city, there's actually no reason to produce material. You can go online and download any of these free of charge. We also can do some limited print productions at HGAC. So there really is no necessary to redevelop this kind of information, but it's available, again, free of charge through our partners. You guys are fairly welcome to grab on anything there that you like for your region too. We have a project ongoing right now trying to look at fat, oil, and grease at rental properties. Again, rental properties are one source of SSOs in terms of fat, oils, and grease in that high dense area, and certainly have a large impact. And so trying to work with some rental properties to put out the information about what to do with your grease and how to actually get rid of it correctly. We're almost done. I want to talk about on-site sewage facility resources. Again, we have staff in hand that can go out and provide a workshop talking to residents and we're trying to work on a realtor program. Again, we used to have a certified program where we could go and talk to realtors and inspectors about how to frame the septic system in the discussion with the potential house buyer to make sure at the point of sale that system gets checked out so that it's not something that's lingering. Additionally, we have some funding that we get from the TCQ's Supplemental Environmental Projects list, as well as the Harris County District Attorney's Office, some limited funds for our SEP to try to repair and replace systems. We currently have replaced since 2018 27 systems. We prepared 15 systems and have about 48 folks waiting to repair the systems. Now you have to have a certain income, 80% of the area's medium income to actually qualify. So that's certainly a limit on the funds and how they can be used. But we do have that program, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, of those 30,000, we need probably 300 million at least at a minimum to even get a headwind on those failing systems. So that brings up really the challenges and opportunities. Talked a little bit about stakeholder involvement and how important that is. Again, as you start getting long in a tooth in a program, again, we're over 10 years now. maintaining those stakeholders' interest, getting new stakeholders to the table. That's really our challenge going forward. Again, getting those phase 2 MUDs involved is certainly something we need to be doing a little bit better job at. And then the implementation viability, actually having on the ground success stories to promote and get folks interested in and actually get things on the ground over the next 10 to 20 year horizon. And finally, funding. We all talk about funding and its challenge. Yeah, there's limited funds for us to do, and we have to look for alternative funding sources and be mindful and have projects ready to go. That's certainly a challenge for us. So moving forward, finding that investment to hit those 3 buckets of sanitary sewer overflows, asset management, stormwater, and on-site sewage systems is where we need to be focused on, and then creating a behavioral change. In the case of on-site sewage facilities, getting those residents who have them to understand that it's a wastewater plant that they personally have, to understand that they need to invest in their own water, much like those of us who pay for centralized wastewater. And so really making that behavioral change is what needs to happen going forward, getting phase 2s to look at impaired waters and what they can do within their jurisdiction to address those phase 2 stormwater challenges. And then, of course, asset management, addressing the sanitary sewer. These resource links will be in the presentation that Hannah shares with you. Certainly want to acknowledge the TCEQ. Most of the funding for the TMDL comes from the TCEQ to maintain the programs. Again, we look for outside funding for a lot of our implementation efforts. With that, I'll open up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your presentation. Before we get to questions, I did just want to call out a really interesting point that I think sometimes even I forget, is that our watersheds here in the North Central Texas region are do flow down to the Houston-Galveston Area Council, and it's really important that what we're putting in our waterways, we're helping treat them so that later on down the line they don't have as many problems. It's especially important. We do currently have a grant through the EPA that's specifically related to litter. It's the Trash-Free Texas, Trash-Free Waters grant, but we're working together with HGAC on that, just again because it's all connected, which is just a fun thing for everyone to remember. But I will take any questions now for Stephen if y'all have them. And then we can also go ahead and kick off into roundtable as well. But I'll take a minute just to make sure that I don't see anything in the chat or anybody's hands raised for questions at this point. All right, not seeing any. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, it's kind of my hope that attendees today will just get to learn more about the San Antonio River Authority and the Houston-Galveston Area Council's programs, and how maybe we can take some of their lessons learned or some of their ideas or implementation that they've done and move it into what the North Central Texas COG can do for you all. Stephen made a really great point that the funding that we do get from TCEQ, yes, supports the TMDL program, but the actual implementation does fall onto our municipalities and other stakeholders, and we don't have necessarily the funding to go out and provide a lot of like the pet waste stations and the printing of materials and those types of things. But maybe we can figure out something to best support you all in the future. So I will stop here. I've got a couple of questions maybe that I'd like to pose to the group if anybody doesn't have anything off the top of their head that they would like to share. Is there an aspect of your TMDL program that you are especially proud of? Is there something that you would love to be able to improve about your TMDL program? Sky's the limit, no funds, no holds barred. And then also, what advice would you give to someone that's newly hired about addressing TCEQ stormwater permit requirements for bacteria impairments. I know we've got a lot of new faces on the line today that may be new to addressing TMDLs. Is there something that COG can provide to you to help bolster your activities or your programs? And then, of course, my last but not least question that I have for the group, are there topics that you want to learn more about that were maybe discussed today? Or maybe it's you just got a really great idea and you want to learn more about whether that's bacteria source tracking, or you want to dive deeper into HGAC's or San Antonio River Authority's programs. So I know those are some 5 pretty broad topics, and we've got about 10 minutes left. So if anybody would like to answer any of these questions, I will hopefully see your answer in the chat or your hand raised.
I guess one thing I'll mention about the stormwater permits, the city of Houston, and I should say Harris County and Harris County Flood Control District, because they hold their permit all together. That phase 1, they've been using our trend line as part of their annual reporting process. And so one of the things we're trying to do with phase 2s is to get them, again, to make that connection between their permit requirement that seeks them to address impaired waters and the opportunities that we may have to work with them to provide that data analysis that helps them in the reporting aspect. So that's one of the things we're trying to do a little bit better job of.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. I know permits have been a hot topic with our group over the past year or so.
I think one thing that I'd like to see is, I think a lot of these things get pushed around the state as far as like specific management measures and control actions. And that's not to say that they're not helpful to take, like a, scoop the poop program going from one place to the next. Like that's helpful, but it also, I wish there was more of an influx of like new ideas. And again, that could just be like a diversity of the people that we're bringing into the group. And we always, bring maybe like water quality practitioners or people that are at least adjacent to the field, but maybe bringing in somebody who's just not at all related to the field could be somebody helpful to come in and just give a new idea or a new spark that's like, oh, we've never seen it from this perspective because we don't have the similar train of thought that you do. So, I don't know, it could just be a nonsensical thought that doesn't really produce any fruit at all. But I just think we have so many of these things that are reused and some of them are useful, but maybe others are more beneficial.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just maybe some fresh eyes on the situation to help the brainstorming process would be great. All right. Well, I'm not hearing a ton. I have one more slide. So again, maybe while the people on the line are mulling over my questions, I just wanted to call out that we do have a few upcoming meetings that are relatively related to the TMDL program. So the Trinity River National Water Trail Task Force meets on May 9th. We have our Regional Stormwater Management Coordinating Council on May 10th. The EPA and Denton County are hosting the Green Asset Management Workshop. Should be an awesome workshop. It'll be from 9 to 3. It will be hybrid, so you can either come visit us at our offices in Arlington, or you can join via Microsoft Teams. And then we also have an upcoming webinar done out of our water quality management program, the lead and copper rule revisions webinar. This is a revisitation of one that was held last year. And then, of course, our annual TMDL Coordination Committee meeting will be held on June 14th. You can add all of these meetings to your calendar by visiting our events page, which I have linked in the chat for you all, and we'll make sure that you have that information in the follow-up as well. And Bridget, I do see your chat. So Bridget from the city of Arlington, in Sean's presentation, he mentioned stormwater and water quality modeling to identify areas to focus efforts. We have so much data related to bacteria sampling and testing. So I'd like to know more about how to create these models. Okay, yeah. Sean, do you have any insight into that you can provide on like a super quick basis? And then maybe we can deep dive into that later on.
It is very complicated, and I would be able to give, I'll give a 30-second overview, but our main modeler is Dr. Sheba Thomas, works here. She's one of our senior engineers. She's done a tremendous job with this modeling effort, but basically it's just it's the TMDL does loading at certain sites. So what her model does, from, again, just an obnoxiously dumbed down version, because that's all, as much as I understand it, is it is an input driven model from a land use perspective and loading perspective that then can propagate to downstream locations, and fate and transport and how long E. coli is in a water system is going to determine how much of that is going to reach the next station and the next station. She does it based on sub basins, and so we have, we talked about the upper San Antonio and then the Salado. The Salado may have, I think it's like, actually I have a map on my desk because she just updated them. The Salado one itself has, it's a fairly small watershed. The Salado one itself has about 265 sub basins, and she has this map where she can say, we need to deploy best management practices here, and then this many, and then it'll meet this standard. And so her model is great, and we've been working with the EPA to see if that could be like the basis of an MS4 permit here in town. So again, I will warn, I am model adjacent, and it's complicated. So I'm more than happy to have Sheba come in. But again, it is deep, dense information that she loves to share and really proud of, and is great. So I'm more than happy to talk to her if the group is interested in her coming and doing a presentation, maybe just on like one of our basins.
Awesome.
And also, I can say, to add to that, EPA is supporting a SWIM model on their website that kind of gives you an introductory into modeling and can be used for some basic stormwater modeling. So if you want to get your feet wet, maybe start there is a good opportunity. Maybe even have Region 6, this is right there in your back door, come and talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great point. That actually might work out to be a really great webinar in the future. Bridget, does that answer your question / statement? Hopefully, would you be interested in? Okay, awesome. See your chat. That would be awesome. Good deal. Okay. Well, we have about 3 minutes left. Does anybody else have any parting thoughts, final questions, statements, ideas for future webinar or workshop topics, or project ideas that you would like COG to take on? Okay, hearing none at this point. My contact information is, of course, on the slide. Thank you all for joining today's workshop. Really appreciate you, Stephen and Sean, for presenting today. Really great to learn about other TMDL programs across the state. This webinar was recorded, and we'll post it on our YouTube page and then also on the NCTCOG TMDL webpage. And I'll make sure that all of our registrants get that email with the link to both the slides and the recording once they are available. Again, if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. My contact information is here, and that'll of course be in the follow-up as well. But thank you all again. This workshop is now adjourned.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Hannah.